everybody! In today's video, I will be mixing embossing powders and doing a little bit of fun alchemy with embossing powder, with paper glaze, with a technique that I learned from Fred Mullet, all sorts of fun things. It might even be my first embossing video. I don't know. I am starting with my Hero Arts MISTI and a piece of craft cardstock. I'm using this gorgeous tree stamp set, which I will link you below. You will need a silhouette image for this technique. This one is very detailed and beautiful. This technique works great for that, but it also works with more solid images and or larger images. So just after you see it, you can pick the kind of image that will be appropriate for you. Now the grid paper that you see me using, I used as a brayer cleaning sheet in a prior gel press session, and I used it today because I thought it was pretty. So that's why it looks messy. It has nothing to do with today's technique. When I put the trees down on my cardstock, I'm doing it upside down so that I can have the stems of the trees go off of the cardstock so that they are not floating. And I'm just making sure that my cardstock is in the corner of the MISTI before I pick up the stamp. Now, when you do this technique, you will want to make sure that your stamp is fairly clean. So I did, out of character, clean my stamp before I did this technique. Oops, I have a very important tool underneath my MISTI, so I will take that out. And then I will make sure that my cardstock is secured in the corner, which is the most important part, before inking up my stamp and stamping it down. I am treating the cardstock with an anti-static pouch. Prior to this, I am going to be using quite a bit of embossing powder, so this step is important. I have a lot of amazing embossing powders from WOW today, including this super chunky gold that I just love. This is great for creating faux wax seals. Very thick embossing powder that I love. I have a bunch of fun colors that I will open up very quickly, sped up for you. And I'm using a combination of opaque and translucent and mixed embossing powders. This is the real joy of WOW embossing powders, is that they have all different kinds. Now I have a coffee stirrer here, and I am cutting this at an angle. This is a very important tool. This is a little trick that I learned from Fred Mullet. And this point acts as both a scoop, and it lets you apply the embossing powder very precisely to your stamped images. Now I have a very well-loved Ink on 3 ink pad here. I'm sorry this is so dirty, but the reason that I love this ink pad the most is it has a very firm foam pad, which I will show you again. And it also is heavy because it holds more ink than a typical embossing ink pad. So it's pretty much my favorite. So I will ink up the trees and stamp them, make sure that my cardstock is back in the corner before I stamp it again. I have the air conditioning on, so I need to stamp this multiple times to make sure that that ink is going to adhere to the embossing powder. If you live in a more humid climate or live in a place where you don't have air conditioning, this might not be necessary, but this actually dries pretty quickly in an extremely air-conditioned environment. And so I have to work a little bit faster and use a little bit more ink than you typically would. Now I will link these embossing powders below, but I particularly like the difference between the opaque pigments and there's a very translucent pigment that is the orange one that I'm using here. And I'm also going to sprinkle a little bit of gold. And for this, I'm going to use a spoon just because it's a little bit chunkier. So I need a bigger scoop. Now, if you just tap your fingers behind the cardstock, the embossing powders will blend together. This is the Fred Mullet technique that I learned in one of his classes. And it makes for a softer blend of those pigments than what you put down. So I'll tap that off and I will emboss that off camera because I have loose embossing powder on my desk, and that would be a disaster. But you can see how shimmery and beautiful and how those different types of embossing powders work together and how the different translucent and opaque pigments look. Now I have little jars, tons of little jars that I collect, and anything that I tapped off, which is a mixture of all these different embossing powders, will go into this jar, and that creates like a funky custom hodgepodge embossing powder that I can use in the future. So don't just throw those in the trash. Once again, I have this nice firm embossing ink pad that I am inking up a stamp with, and I'm just using the same stamp. I haven't taken it off my MISTI, but I'm doing it on white cardstock so that you can see the difference. And once again, I will put a little bit of gold and use the coffee stirrer to apply individual embossing powder pigments too. I love the way it gets kind of a watercolor look when you combine them on the ink. Now, I just knocked over an entire container of embossing powder, but never fear. I will just cut that piece of paper off of my grid mat and save that because that's actually one of my favorite colors. So don't be like me. Don't be that clumsy. Again, putting the excess into my custom embossing powder jar. And then because I didn't get the stems correctly done because the air conditioning is drying it, I'm just leaving the stamp in the MISTI, inking it again, and adding a little bit more powder so that that can be totally covered before I finalize everything with the heat gun. So now I've heated it up. You can see how shiny it is, and that little AZTEC translucent bit, I just love that. So here they are together. You can see how different it is on colored cardstock than it is on white cardstock. Next, I will do even more dramatic embossing because I'm going to do it on a dark gray. Now this is actually a card base, so I'm going to put it in the MISTI, but I'm going to put it upside down so that I'm stamping the trees the right way because I'm not moving this stamp. And this time I'll stamp it in white pigment ink. This is Gina K ink, just to add some light behind the colors that I'm adding to this wet ink with the embossing powder, using all the same colors. Love that AZTEC, adding the pink and the turquoise and the green, and then just tapping the back to move the embossing powders around the image. Saving the excess, and look how colorful that is. Now I'll show you the magic of the embossing this time so you can see it transform, and you can see that olive green get so much more intense after I melt it, and how beautiful and shiny that is on the gray cardstock. So there they are together. And now I'm going to do something completely different. I have a fun stencil from Picket Studios, and I'm using the Golden Rose paper glaze. I've treated the stencil with Pixie spray so that it sticks directly to my cardstock. And I'm applying the paper glaze through the stencil onto this cardstock, sort of scraping it down so that it's smooth. And you can see how shiny that is. And now I will add the olive green and the pink embossing powders to the wet paper glaze. This is magical. Saving the excess. And now I will heat this up, and while the paper glaze is still wet, you will see that it will begin to bubble just a little bit. So you get not only the fun shimmer from the paper glaze, you get texture from the bubbling, and you get the shine and the color from the embossing powder. I decided to let that sit for a little bit. Let the paper glaze dry just a little bit more before reheating it again, and you can see how amazing that looks, how shiny it is. All the embossing powder is melted. How much fun that is. My friend Michelle Lupton taught me how to do this technique, and I just love it. This is such a fun stencil. So here are all the projects together, very different looks. You can combine embossing powder with any medium that stays wet for a few minutes, and that's what I've done here. I've used the same dye across all of the tree cards for consistency. And we have a fun blog hop and some prizes, so head over to my blog for more information and a giveaway. And thanks so much for watching.